We'll be looking at taxonomy. You are welcome to learn with bonitas.com. The word taxonomy deals with the science of classification. It deals with the science of classification, identification, and the naming of organisms. These three words is the most important aspect of taxonomy: classification, identification, and the naming of living organism. So you define taxonomy as the science of classification of living things, identification of living things, and the naming of living organisms. Why taxonomy? Taxonomy is very important because there are millions, if not billions, of living organisms in existence, and we cannot study each of these living organisms one after the other. We cannot study them individually. So there is a need to look at the organisms that have similar features, group them together, and study them in groups. This gives rise to what we call the taxonomy. So it's a branch of biology that deals with the classification, identification, and naming of a living organism. Now, it's very important to understand the levels of classification of living things. The scientists that made most important achievements in attempt to classify living organisms, because there are many naturalists, philosophers that have attempted to classify living organisms until Carolus Linnaeus made a very successful classification of living organisms. In naming of organisms, in identification of organisms, this is a practical approach of taxonomy. Is a practical approach of biology, where from the features you'll be able to identify that this organism should belong or should be classified here or should be classified to the other group. So the identification is the practical approach of the biology. Is the from what you identify you'll be able to classify. In the naming of organism is also very important because different people have different names for a particular organism. So there should be a universally accepted system of naming organism, such that when we mention that name, we will know that we are talking about this particular organism. So the naming of organism is a universally scientific, acceptable method of giving names to an organism, which we are going to see. So we are starting with the classification of living organisms. The classification of living organisms. Classification of living organisms, of living things. I said earlier that there are many people who made attempt to classify the living things, but one that is worthy of note is that classification by Carolus Linnaeus. Carolus Linnaeus' classification was based on morphological features of the organism. His classification was based on morphological features of organisms. That's the organisms that have the same physical features, appearance, will be classified in a particular group. It's different from that of Charles Darwin, we know, that tried to classify living things based on their phylogenetic features. In phylogenetic features, organisms are classified based on their evolutionary origin. Based on their evolutionary origin. This one is based on their physical appearance. Charles evolutionary origins classification of living things was done by Charles Darwin. This was done by Carolus Linnaeus. This was done by Charles Darwin, which we know as a father of evolutionary theory. So, why Carolus Linnaeus is known as the father of taxonomy? So we're going to look at the Carolus Linnaeus. Linnaeus is known as the father of taxonomy. So we're going to look at the Carolus Linnaeus levels of classification. So we're going to look at the Carolus Linnaeus levels of classification